And our top story on World DNA, in another blow to President Bashar al-Assad's forces, Syrian rebels captured the central Syrian city of Hama just days after seizing the city of Aleppo.
According to Syria War Monitor, the rebels stormed Hama from several sides and engaged in street battles with Assad's forces. That's before announcing the complete takeover of the city. The rebels let off volleys of celebratory gunfire as they entered Syria's fourth largest city. They pledged to advance towards Damascus.
Now, many residents turned out to welcome the rebels, while a giant poster of Assad on the city hall was set on fire. The Syrian army admitted losing control of the city, which is strategically located between Aleppo and Assad's east of power in Damascus. The rebels, led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, are expected to push on towards Homs, which lies just about 40 kilometers south of Hama.
However, the army said it was redeploying outside the city to reserve and preserve the civilian lives and prevent urban combat. Footage released by Syrian state media showed the government forces fighting the rebels around Hama. Syria's defense minister Ali Abbas insisted that the army's withdrawal was a temporary tactical measure.
The War Monitor said tens of thousands of members of President Assad's minority community are fleeing Homs, heading towards the Syrian coast, fearing the rebel advance.
Furthermore, Syrian rebel chief Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani has urged Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammad Shia al-Sudani to keep his armed forces away from the conflict in Syria.
كما نجح العراق ونجح السيد محمد شيع السوداني أن ينأى بنفسه عن الحرب التي بين إيران وبين المنطقة في الآونة الأخيرة، فنشد على يده أيضا أن ينأى بالعراق من أن يدخل في أتون حرب جديدة مع ما يجري في سوريا.
And this comes after Iraq's Kataib Hezbollah armed group called on Baghdad to send troops to Syria to support the Damascus government. Iran-aligned Kataib Hezbollah is part of Hashd al-Shabi, an alliance of Iran-backed former paramilitary groups now integrated in Iraq's regular armed forces.
In yet other news, Iraqi Shiite cleric Muqtada Sadr urged his country to stay out of the fighting in neighboring Syria, triggered by a lightning offensive launched by rebels last week.
Meanwhile, Syrians in Aleppo suffer from shortages of essential needs after rebels took over. Bakeries are short on bread, and footage showed people lining for bread and petrol.
And well, for more on this, we are now being joined by Professor James A. Russell from California. He's the Associate Professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at NPS. Welcome to World DNA, Professor Russell.
Thank you.
Now, in less than a week after the rebels took control of Aleppo, they have now captured the city of Hama. Talk to us what happens next if the rebels' incursion is not controlled in time, and where does all this leave the Assad regime, keeping in mind that his allies are already engaged in conflicts in their own countries?
I think you've hit the nail on the head with your last observation. It appears, at least based on the footage we've been seeing on the news these last several days, that we're looking at a repeat of the Taliban's advance in Afghanistan, in which the government forces essentially gave up and ran away. So the question, sort of facing the Assad regime is whether its army is going to stand and fight. And of course, the last time the Syrian civil war was in a higher intensity, kind of mode, you had Iran and Hezbollah and various militias doing a significant amount of the fighting. And Hezbollah, as you have just commented, is on the back foot. It's suffered greatly from the Israelis in the recent war, and it's not clear that the organization is really in a position to render outside assistance. Then you have the Russians, of course, who have their naval base at Tartus, and it's not clear that they really have sufficient forces in place to affect events on the battlefield. So you also have to remember that that Assad, in addition to being supported by outside actors, is supported internally by the Alawites and by the Christians who are fleeing before the Islamist advances, so to speak. So the question is, are these internal groups going to answer the call, so to speak, and get onto the front lines and defend the regime, this brutally repressive regime? And of course, that is an unknown. If the forces continue to melt away,
Right.
I would expect to see the forces driving on to the next city. And they've already effectively divided the country in two at this point. So the Assad regime is under significant pressure here.
And it's really interesting that you mentioned oppressive because when we look at the visuals when the rebels, they entered Hama, it seemed like the people there, they were clapping and welcoming. Do you think there is a reason for that?
Well, this is, again, Hama, you have to remember that these places were strong sort of Islamist sort of population centers. And of course, they're the site of some of the worst massacres in the early 1980s by the Assad regime against the Muslim Brotherhood. So these places are hotbeds, or were, at least in the past, they were sort of strongly in line with the Islamist forces. Now, so as the advance continues, it's not clear what the attitude of the population is going to be. But certainly, the Islamic and the Sunni Islamist, sort of populations are relieved, of course, to have their the liberators appearing. And it has also to be said that the Islamist groups that comprise these myriad groups that are advancing have attempted to sort of distance themselves from the Al-Qaeda, Nusra Front, Ansar al-Sunnah, sort of vestiges of the past, right? And they're trying to, I think, reach out to many confederational groups, positioning themselves as pragmatic Islamists on the model of Hamas.
Right.
So the politics of all of this, of course, are evolving and difficult to sort of evaluate as the fighting is unfolding, because you have also to remember that there's other fighting going on between the Syrian National Army, this overtly Turkish entity,
Yes, exactly.
with the Kurds in the eastern part of the country, which have been aligned with the United States in the West. And they provided many of the foot soldiers for the fight against ISIL. So it's a real
Right.
dog's breakfast, of different groups fighting for different objectives, not all of whom, these groups that is, agree, of course, on political objectives. And this is all going to unfold, I would say, over the the immediate future. Yeah.
Right, Professor Russell, very rapid developments taking place in Syria. And as we are learning right now that the rebels are now moving towards Homs after capturing Hama. But thank you for joining us on WION with your insights on the story.
My pleasure. Thank you.